Diversity, the hot topic. This subject is a massive meat grinder of a topic, but I think an aspect of it is something most people could agree on is there is a lack of geographical diversity in the film industry. By film industry, I mean Hollywood. Do we really need any more historical dramas about Britain? There are more than 40 countries in Europe, but besides Britain, France, and Italy, the rest is mostly some kind of villain like. If it's a smart villain, Germany. If it's a petty criminal or a scary mob guy, then east from there, anything basically. I know the top 3 countries have an excellent film industry, and major directors came from these places, but still, I'm pretty sure any of these 40 countries have at least one story more worthy of telling than another film about a king or queen of England. Also, Egypt, especially anything with Cleopatra, is the African version of Queen Victoria. And I also don't get why they insist that Cleopatra was black when you only need to go down a teeny tiny bit further down and you will find 100% no doubt black historical figures that are also interesting. The same thing is true with states like Texas, California, and New York. They are basically the setting for 90% of the time if it's about America. But when you make a movie about that, why make them black when there are black historical figures who were not slaves of a Western colony or civil rights activists, but kings or warlords or politicians? The interesting stories are there if you do some research. Woman King was a good direction in my opinion, just lazy with the research part. The problem is the way they diversify existing products, like in the case of Disney live-action remakes. I don't find making The Little Mermaid black a bad idea necessarily, but I find changing the entire character into something like completely different, hurting the structure of a story. And it doesn't give anything new really. They somehow change these characters completely, but the story is less. If you change Snow White to a powerful feminist from a naive fish out of water story, then that's a completely different story. Also, there isn't really a story, it's just a Snow White skin in a very different movie. The trope is from her that you dislike, you know. The princess saved by the prince, all that. It really comes from here, I mean in movies. It's literally this. If you dislike this, why make it? You can remake Triumph of the Will into Hitler's gigantic coming out, but that's not really Triumph of the Will, is it? I know in Master and Commander's case, where they changed the American pirates to French, that they were afraid if it's against Americans won't appreciate it. Or if it's on an unknown territory, people won't watch it. The movie won't sell, but I doubt if the film is good that's gonna be a problem. Letters from Iwo Jima goes directly against that, as it was better received than Flags of Our Fathers, and I'm pretty sure because a film from the Japanese perspective is more interesting at this point. Let's take World War II. It literally is a world war, but instead of not making the 100th movie about the Western Front, they actually do that exactly. It's a world war. But even in Europe, there are theaters that are barely touched, and not because these were boring. And when a good film like Dunkirk comes out, and there isn't enough North African or black soldiers in the picture, has a grain of truth, it's kind of a little bit justified, but I mean besides the quotas, but it is still silly to complain about that instead of asking why don't they make a movie about the events in Africa? Colonial powers were clashing over their heads, but many African nations took part in the fights. I'm pretty sure there are some more interesting stories about Ethiopian guerrillas to be made than something with the French resistance. And I have 3 topics in mind that are geographically lesser known, but are quite exciting and unique. Let's take the Gurkhas. Better to die than be a coward is the saying of the Gurkhas, a special military faction from Nepal that fought across the globe during World War II. Renowned for their fighting spirit and jungle warfare prowess, the Gurkhas have become legendary figures in military history. The tales of their bravery and tenacity are so legendary that it's challenging to find any accounts questioning their exceptional abilities. The Gurkhas were famous for their distinctive kukri curved knife, which they believed had to draw blood if pulled out, leading them to cut at least their thumb before sheathing it again. In the early stages of the war, as the British faced significant challenges, they needed every soldier from every corner of the empire, including the Gurkhas, who actually volunteered. The British were in big trouble in the early stages of the war, so they needed every soldier from every corner of the empire, so that's why the Gurkhas fought at the Far East against the Japanese and against European Axis powers at North Africa and Italy. Besides all these premises having credible film potential, what is more diverse than Nepalese soldiers fighting the Japanese in Burma and Malaya, or fighting against Nazis in North Africa? Doesn't that sound more exciting than something in France? The Gurkhas, though, suffered heavy losses, many times in open combat, so you could say they are better suited for asymmetric warfare, but by every account, enemy or ally, they were always regarded incredibly brave and tenacious. Maybe the best example is Lachiman Gurung. I'm pretty sure I'm not saying that right. A Gurkha who fought off 200 Japanese soldiers, even after losing an eye and his fingers on one hand to a grenade. He fired and reloaded a bolt-action rifle with his left hand. Wave after wave of Japanese attacks were turned back as Gurung shouted, according to him, "Come and fight a Gurkha." The Japanese attacks continued on the isolated Gurkha unit for 2 more days. It's unclear how Gurung survived the continuous fighting, but his bravery against overwhelming odds emboldened the rest of the platoon until reinforcements finally arrived. He was awarded for bravery, or with the Victoria Cross, the highest honor in Britain. I mean, highest military honor. I mean, if it was written by someone, people would roll their eyes how unrealistic it is, but even if it's partially true, it's pretty badass. 2. Papua New Guinea. Fuzzy Angels. One of the most difficult battle landscape of the war was Papua New Guinea. The native tribes of Papua played an important role in the war efforts of the Allies, especially the Australians, as the difficult terrain was underestimated by both the Japanese and the Australians. Many couldn't take the infinity hiking up and down the mountains. Where the Australians, being more familiar with the natives, recruited them to help with logistics and fighting, but the most important part was their familiarity. The large role invited the freshly recruited Australian militia that was mocked even by Australians for not being battle ready could stand up with experienced Japanese troops, and I mean experienced in jungle fighting. Meanwhile, many Japanese soldiers tortured and killed natives they could put their hands on. In Dan Carlin's Hardcore History Supernova on the East series, there is a good part where he talks about how many people regard Stalingrad and the general harsh winters of the Eastern Front as a nightmare scenery in the war regarding location, but muddy, humid, disease-ridden environment of the Papuan jungle with all kinds of harmful insects and bugs everywhere, it might be even worse. Natives' perspective would be very interesting as they debate about the different foreign people getting lost in the jungle. It could be an excellent film about the importance of knowing your environment and the difficulty of asymmetric warfare in an environment where both participating armies need assistance. Many countries were freed by the Allies from Axis occupation during World War II, but Iraq was the other way around. Iraq sought out Axis help so it can get free from British colonial rule. It's an interesting situation where the oppressed party actually seen the opportunity of freedom in the Third Reich and not the other way around. I think it's an interesting perspective how these pawns in the war, which there were many more of than of big dogs, they not necessarily seen the two sides of the World War as Allies the absolute good and the Axis as absolute evil. Many small nations were glad to see the Soviet Union, France or Great Britain on its knees, and who can blame a colony that took the opportunity to try to break out from the rule of Britain when it was weakened? The support the Germans and the Italians provided was not great. The Germans and the Italians basically provided like 50 airplanes for the war effort. The battle itself is short, not one of the highlights of the war. I think it would be an interesting situation where Germans and Italians are not worse. Well, the war itself is not one of the more exciting ones of the Second World War, but the situation itself when German and Italian supporters of the protagonist side are hard to vilify when on the other side you have the British who are crushing the Iraqis' attempts for freedom. In 1942, a pro-German coup took place in Iraq, leading to an uprising against the British presence in the country. The coup was backed by Rashid Ali al-Gailani, who became the Prime Minister of Iraq at the time. In response to the uprising, Britain launched a military campaign known as the Anglo-Iraqi War in May 1941. The British forces, along with Commonwealth troops, including Gurkhas from Nepal and Sikhs from India, were deployed to suppress the rebellion and restore control over Iraq. Ultimately, the British and the Commonwealth forces defeated the Iraqi forces by the end of May 1941. The uprising was crushed, and Iraq remained under British influence until it gained full independence in 1948. These are my 3 favorites, but there are tons of stories in this theme. I mean, World War II is done to death, but only some parts of it are done to death. I think these 3 subjects, these guerrillas fighting the fascist invaders, and nobody really helping them, that's pretty interesting. Also, the Siege of Singapore, it's a brilliant battle, but I actually don't know if there is anything about that, any movies about that. So maybe if you think there is an even better than my top 3, then tell me.